Did you see the sign? Hello, Assalamu alaikum, folks. Welcome everybody to Unbounded Stories series with Sadaa Echoes. My name is Azzuddin Hawam, the founder of Sadaa. Sadaa is an organization dedicated to amplifying stories of marginalized communities, focusing on healing, community, and empathy. Today, I am with my dear friend Sarah, who I've met at Banff while we were learning together on the land. Welcome here, Sarah, and I'm excited that you are with me.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm so grateful.
Thank you so much. Today, we want to chat a little bit together on the notion of learning on the land and how learning on the land heals us. So, let me start by asking you, what does learning on the land mean to you?
Yeah, it's such a great question and such a timely question these days. It just, as soon as you say that, it reminds me that all learning is ultimately on the land. We just, somewhere along the way, we got a little bit disconnected from that in our classrooms and other spaces. But really, since the beginning of time, all knowledge and all learning has emerged from the land. So for me, it's like a coming home. It's like a sense of being connected to what's always been the source of knowledge, and it's that sense of relationality and belonging, and it always just feels right.
I appreciate that, and I can echo that. I mean, just running into people on the land while I was running a few sessions, and people coming in, people who I've never met, of course. As soon as they saw people coming together on the land, sharing a meal, you could see that the weight has dropped. Like you could feel it. People just come in and they sit, and for maybe for the first time for many of them, that's when they started to breathe freely. And so for me, and that's the second question I've been thinking about. How do we build relationship then? How is relationship building different when you are in the land or on the land? Then how is it different than when you're in a classroom, for example, or in a building or in a space? And what does that teach us?
Yeah, I think when we learn together on the land in that way, there's just sort of like a democratizing effect. Like it reminds us all that we come from the land, that we are all equal on the land. And I think it just grounds everyone to kind of be inspired to speak from their heart and their true self. And so I think you can go deeper into those truths immediately instead of having to work through any barriers or masks. So it always just feels like a more authentic place to share a story, and we just meet people in a different way on the land.
Mm.
And of course, when you brought in a whole other medicine when you bring food to share on the land, because even though we were sharing food together in the conference in a dining room, when you eat it on the land together, I think that also has a different kind of healing effect. And you shared a story about that had a profound impact on people, and reminding us that not only does all knowledge come from the land, but the source of all our nourishment comes from the land. And when we share that together, it just kind of grounds us in that space. And
Yeah, my grandmother would often take us on the land, and there we had a big apricot tree, and she would sit under the apricot tree, and she would lean on the apricot tree, the big trunk, and she would sit there, and she would touch the trunk, and she would say, "Now I am with my family."
mhm.
And I remember that, and I remember how for her it wasn't away from herself. The tree wasn't an extension to self, but it was the self.
Mm.
And I've never thought one day I could carry those feelings too, especially when I'm away from my land. And so for me, I want to ask, how do you do that in your practice? I know you work in institutions, academic institutions, and so on. How does that work in your daily life and your daily practice? If you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm lucky enough in my role as an associate professor at Mount Royal University to be able to take my students on the land quite a bit. So a lot of my courses are experiential, land based. And even those ones that aren't, that are in the classroom, I try to weave that in by sending the students out on assignments. Like my students will have assignments where they have to go and find a place in nature that feels peaceful, or hug a tree, or walk bare feet on the land, and then write about it. And I think, yeah, especially in this day and age where with artificial intelligence and so many things separating us from the land, I think just even little moments of experiential learning like that outside of the classroom can just, it just reminds people who they are and where
Mm,
they come from and that they belong.
truly, and they can also heal. So, Sarah, the question I asked last year, and I often ask this because being on the land also brings out responsibilities. Like we are on the land, taking care of it and so on. What do you think is the most or the number one responsibility for educators, for learners when they are on the land, like yourself and of course myself who tells stories on the land all the time? And I think of notions of care, and I think of notions
Mm,
of justice, and I think of notion of standing with those who have maybe been pushed out of their lands and marginalized away from their lands and so on. What kind of responsibilities do we have as
mm.
educators when we are on the land?
Yeah, that's a great question because I think bringing up all those layers of responsibility is super important. That it's not just learning that's happening on the land. It's like we said before, it's learning that's happening with the land. And I think to do that in like an ethical, relational, responsible way, you have to be aware of the stories of the land that you're on, and not just, in many cases it's just sort of the recent colonial history of that land, rather than knowing, not just knowing the indigenous stories of that land, but having ongoing reciprocal relationships with indigenous peoples on that land, so that your stories are informed by ongoing story making with others whose ancestors are from that land. And I think that's what really is required in, whether we call it land-based learning or place-based. It's taking on that responsibility as an educator, whether you're indigenous or non-indigenous or a newcomer to the land, to know those stories and to know the complexities of all those layers, and to take responsibility for being like a good ancestor.
That's beautiful. And thank you for that beautiful answer. What is the one thing you would leave in closing? What is the one thing you would leave new teachers with, the new educators with?
Mm.
As they're getting into the education profession. I work with a lot of those folks. And of course, they want to get the lesson plans right. They want to make sure they show up on time. They want to make sure all the units are covered. And that's a wonderful thing. But when it comes to the land, what can we leave them with?
I think it's important to remember that one of the barriers that always comes up for new educators is that they might not feel confident or have experience or know how to do it, or they're afraid they're not going to do it the right way. And I think the advice I would give any educator is that to remind yourself that you do have a direct connection with the land, no matter
Mm.
where you're from and no matter what your background is. Every human being once had an umbilical cord to their mother earth, and like, just to like go and sit on the land and reconnect that, and to remember that the land will work with you, it'll speak with you, and it'll come over time. So I guess the advice is like not to let any barriers get in the way of that direct relationship you have with the land. That's your
Thank you.
birthright.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. And I think I want to leave you with that picture on my screen is a picture of the olive trees in my
Ah,
village.
so
And
beautiful.
I would love one day, and I hope one day you can come to our home, into our land. I will take care of you and make you sage tea right
Mm.
underneath that olive tree. Thank you,
Oh,
Sarah, for being with us. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and gifts. Thank you, folks, for being with us on Unbounded Stories. If I can leave you with anything today, get on the land, greet it, take care of it, stand with it, love it, and most importantly, bring your community with you on the land and eat with them. Follow us at Sadaa.Echoes. Shukran.